Hey all, my name is Liz and I'm going to be talking to you today about hate crimes. So hate crimes have been surfacing in the news pretty often lately, and you always hear about these hate groups, the KKK or Nazi extremists. So we're just going to get into that. According to the National Institute of Justice, quote, the term hate crime was coined in the 1980s by journalists and policy advocates who were attempting to describe a series of incidents directed at Jews, Asians, and African Americans, end quote. And now the legal definition for hate crimes, or bias crimes as they're also called, straight from the FBI site is, quote, a criminal offense against a person or property motivated in whole or in part by an offender's bias against a race, religion, disability, sexual orientation, ethnicity, gender, or gender identity, end quote. And the FBI was also very careful on their website to state that hate itself is not a crime, but when someone acts upon that hate is when it becomes a legal issue. Now, according to the statistics recorded by the FBI, in 2010, out of 7,690 single-based offenses, meaning just one instance of a crime, the top three motivations for hate crimes were racial bias, which was 48.4%, sexual orientation bias at 19.1%, and religious bias at 18.3%. Now in 2016, which is just 6 years later, there were 7,227 documented single offenses, and of these, the top three motivations were race/ethnicity/ancestry bias at 58.5%, religious bias at 21.3%, and sexual orientation bias at 16.9%. In addition to this information, the National Institute of Justice stated that about on average, 60% of racially motivated hate crimes are targeted at black individuals, while only 30% are targeted at white individuals. The majority of these crimes are also committed by unemployed males rather than females, and they also found that these crimes are usually committed to alleviate boredom, for fun, or just to get a rush. So from all of these statistics, we can see that the number of crimes reported has essentially stayed the same, although there were slightly less in 2016 compared to 2010, but the number of crimes which were motivated by race jumped by 10%. This is pretty shocking because we always stand by this notion that we're a country that accepts all people regardless of race. We can also see that the bias against religion went up by a few percentages, but sexual orientation bias has actually dropped. I find these trends pretty interesting because from them, it seems that biases against different races and religion are increasing, but hate for sexual orientation is decreasing. A psychologist by the name of Edward Dunbar states, quote, those who commit hate crimes are not mentally ill in the traditional sense. They're not diagnosably schizophrenic or manic depressive. What they do share, however, is a high level of aggression and antisocial behavior. These people are not psychotic, but they're consistently very troubled, very disturbed, very problematic members of our community who pose a huge risk for future violence, end quote. What Dunbar is explaining here is that offenders who commit hate crimes are not mentally ill, even though it may seem that way, but rather they have a mental disturbance and a distortion about certain groups of people. Another quote here is that when people don't know much about a group, they're likely to ascribe to them the notion of a cultural essence, a sort of innate temperament they erroneously believe defines the entire culture. This statement is correct, and it also ties in with the other quote about how hate crime offenders are not mentally ill, but they do have some kind of distortion about a certain culture or group. Based off of these characteristics of hate crime offenders, we can build a list of treatment needs for these specific people. These needs really include having the offender gain an understanding of the other cultures, religions, etc., because this is a big cause of hate crime. Ignorance towards a group can cause us to negatively stereotype them, and in the case of hate crime offenders, it can make them place all those members of that group under one big umbrella. Another big need is to get these offenders up close with members of the group they see negatively in a safe, controlled manner, which is this real contact with members of those groups. Now that we've laid the groundwork, we can get into discussing what in the past, if anything, has been done to combat these hate crimes and treat those offenders. Although this isn't a treatment by definition, in the past the media has gotten involved in the prevention of hate crimes, which I guess can be seen as a pre-treatment or like a deterrence. DeAngelis mentions how when President Bush was in office, his administration made public announcements that it was, quote, un-American, end quote, to be biased against other races, cultures, etc., since we ourselves are a nation of immigrants. Prior to this statement, however, there was really not much done about hate crime. As previously mentioned, the term was only coined a few decades ago, so the offense is still pretty new. This is why not many programs exist, because we're still researching this group of offenders and how to make successful treatments. Unfortunately, most of the treatment programs that I found are ones used by other countries, which means that there are not many in existence for the United States, but they are still worth exploring. And a good amount of these treatment programs are also directed at the victims of hate crimes rather than the offenders. So like was previously mentioned, most programs available out there regarding hate crimes are for the victims rather than for the offender. And there's a website, transequality.org, that has a great page about how to handle victims of those crimes, and it's linked in the final slide of the presentation. So I recommend just taking the time to read it because it's really interesting and it's pretty educational. So there are many programs available to prevent hate crimes rather than to actually treat the offender. But when it comes to the offenders themselves, the United Kingdom has a program called ADAPT. According to Felsinger and colleagues, ADAPT stands for Anti-Discriminatory Awareness Practice Training, which follows a cognitive behavioral approach, which is usually the standard across the board for successful rehabilitation programs, and it was a series of 12 classes which were held bi-weekly. Multisystematic therapy has also been used, but primarily to rehabilitate youths because it is family and community-based. Getting support is important, especially for youths who are still developing, and this treatment has been found to be very successful. There's also counseling with encounter sessions, such as this 3-day program which was initiated by the Assistant U.S. Attorney in California. Having encounters with groups who are the subjects of hate crimes is by far the most effective way to rehabilitate offenders because they usually don't know much about the group and hate them based on little to no information about their culture and so on. I did find one abstract, however, from an article which was written by Jack McDevitt and Rebecca Pfeffers in 2010 from the ASC, which stated, quote, most American programs targeting the crime offenders focused on youthful offenders and generally lasted between 2 and 6 months, with 1 session per week. Not surprisingly, a common program goal was to change the attitude and prejudices of offenders through a mixture of education, empathy, and deterrence, yet the specific curricula of each program ranged rather broadly. The most surprising find of this study is that none of the identified programs in the United States are still functioning. So unfortunately, I couldn't access the entire article because it was no longer available, but this information is important because it tells us that there were some programs in effect for offenders of hate crimes, but they're not really still in function today. So based on the fairly small amount of information that we know about hate crime offenders, multisystematic therapy, which is according to Dunbar again, has been found to be successful in youths, and it would be effective if it was used for adults, but it's mostly used for youths because, as previously mentioned, it's family and community-based, and youths are still growing and developing, their brains aren't fully matured, so they kind of need that interaction and support. But what does not work, according to Dunbar, are simple interventions, which are just sitting down and talking to the offender about their hate crimes, because they need to get up close and personal with the hate crime victims, which is not involved in this approach. So if we want to know if these treatments are effective, we could go to the Uniform Crime Report from the FBI, because these statistics are gathered every year by a bunch of different police departments, and it states how many crimes were reported. Like before, in 2016 we had those 7,000, and then previously we had like the 7,600. Recidivism rates of offenders are also a good way to test treatments, as well as self-report surveys. Now, self-report surveys would be better in a therapy session because you could just give that to the offender rather than recidivism rates, which are still a great measurement, but sometimes the recidivism isn't recorded, so it's a little inaccurate. So there are really a multitude of ways that we could improve treatment for hate crime offenders, mostly because there are really little to no treatment programs in existence, at least in the United States, for these types of people right now. So Dunbar mentions to have comprehensive risk assessments, which I think could also be tied into the R&R model of risk need responsivity, where we basically gauge a specific offender's risk level and how much we think that they're going to reoffend and how they respond to treatment. So this also ties into having more specialized programs because, as we've seen and heard, there are really not many available for specific hate crime offenders, just a lot for the victims. I also think that introducing restorative justice is a really great idea for this specific group of offenders too, because in restorative justice, the victim and offender work hand in hand so that they can restore justice to the community and to the victim. And if an offender is spending a lot of time with the victim in their community, then they're going to learn more about the culture and how hard it might be for that particular group to function in society. These are links to all the sources that I used during this presentation, and in the middle there is that transequality.org that I mentioned that I highly recommend checking out. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this, and I hope you learned at least a little bit of something today.